Our virtual panel discusses the effectiveness of tax incentives in Youngstown after an investigative series from the Business Journal and ProPublica. Hear what they have to say on today's Daily Buzz.
Today's Business Journal Daily Buzz is brought to you by 717 Credit Union.
Two Youngstown City Council members acknowledge that the city's use of tax incentives to spur economic growth hasn't always worked. During a virtual discussion, 1st Ward Councilman Julius Oliver and 7th Ward Councilwoman Basia Adamczak respond to the findings of an investigative series by the Business Journal in partnership with ProPublica. The investigation found that about half of the companies that entered into enterprise zone agreements with the city over the last 30 years failed to create the number of jobs promised. In this discussion, which was hosted by the Business Journal and ProPublica and co-sponsored by the City Club of the Mahoning Valley and WKSU, City Council members are joined by the Business Journal's Dan O'Brien, ProPublica's Mike Mishak, and Greg LeRoy, the Executive Director of Good Jobs First.
I hope you've had a chance to read the Business Journal stories that are the basis for what our panelists will be talking about today. This year, the Business Journal, in partnership with ProPublica, is investigating Mahoning Valley's use of tax incentives, giving companies major tax breaks to locate in the county in exchange for good-paying jobs. This has included Youngstown's tax incentives for Chill Can, promoted as the world's first self-chilling beverage can, and Lordstown's massive tax breaks for General Motors. But these investments have failed to deliver the economic boom that was promised. And here to talk about that today, we have a wonderful panel. We've got Dan O'Brien, who is the Business Journal reporter who's been writing this series. We're joined by Councilman Julius Oliver, who represents Youngstown's 1st Ward. We've got Councilwoman Basia Adamczak of Youngstown's 7th Ward. Greg LeRoy, Executive Director of Good Jobs First, a DC-based nonprofit focusing on government and corporate accountability. And we've got the editor of the series, who will be our moderator today, ProPublica Senior Editor Michael Mishak.
I wanted to explain a little bit about ProPublica's interest in Youngstown. I'm an editor in what we call the Local Reporting Network, and that's really a program that's designed to boost investigative journalism at local news organizations across the country. And when we saw last year that the Youngstown Vindicator was closing, we realized that that was putting Youngstown and Mahoning Valley in danger of becoming a news desert. So we solicited proposals and from a variety of news outlets, asking them what was the story that Youngstown needed to hear, what needed to be investigated. And so Dan O'Brien at the Business Journal, we chose his proposal. And it was really compelling. I mean, Youngstown has played a prominent role on the national stage year after year after year. And politicians, national politicians, presidents from Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump have used it as a backdrop, as a political backdrop. And it's been a symbol of sort of the post-industrial decline, with politicians offering various remedies, to for a way out, for a way forward, for a new day, for the industrial Midwest. But year after year, and election cycle after election cycle, little seemed to change. And Dan, can you give us, the audience, a sense? Hopefully, many people have read the work, but for those who haven't, can you just kind of sum up in a nutshell what you found?
Sure. What we did find is half of those companies that are engaged in the enterprise zone program, which the city has really enacted since the late 1980s, about half of them have failed to create the number of jobs that they had promised, and about a fourth of them creates at all. So it really played into whether or not it has been the most effective tool for developing this economy. So when it comes to these sort of programs and how they're evaluating we ascertain what is good economic policy. It's played a role, I think. It's not one of, it's a factor, I think, as to what we've seen occur here over the last number of decades. But we've seen this happen time and time again throughout the course of the Mahoning Valley. And not only that, but we've seen the lack of city residents benefiting from the jobs that are offered by a lot of these companies who are getting these subsidies and getting these tax abatements. So there seems to be not a whole lot of bang for our buck, I think, when it comes down to it, in the entire scope of this program. When you look at it, company through company through company.
Yeah, I mean, on that point, I'd like to bring in Councilman Oliver and Councilwoman Adamczak to this discussion. So when you hear, those kind of, statistics and kind of the performance record, of the city as it pertains to the enterprise zone program, where just companies have delivered on the job promises and a quarter have created none. I mean, I guess we could kick it off with Councilwoman Adamczak. I mean, what do you think when you hear those statistics?
I feel the article was very well written. There were things that were, in a sense, lacking that did not happen exactly as we were hoping to, but also dismissed the tremendous financial benefit that we were able to see from some of the recurring. If I may just give you a brief background and kind of where we got here. So previously, the city had over 500 acres of abandoned fuel sites, and there we were able to put in three, because I don't want to misquote anything, so I have some notes. 3 business parks actually contributed to the tax base of the city, both with income tax revenue and with real estate taxes. Forestry land is worth here in Youngstown, it's about $5,000 per acre. And it's about a $55,804 amount of money that was able to be generated from tax that, per year. And it's important to understand that generated tax is never abated. The abatement is used, the application of land and the improvements that are being made to the land. So although we are giving some type of tax abatements and incentives to these companies, it is still generating more revenue than we would have otherwise had if we would not give these tax. We face some challenges. I mean, it's a competitive market here in Ohio as it is nationally, so we have to be able to offer something that perhaps other cities cannot. As we all know, the reality is we have a challenging school system, and there's other challenges. It is the tax abatements. So we actually, and if you look at the investment that was done in the land, for example, at the Salt Springs Park, we were able to increase the land value by 462%. At Performance Place, it was increased to 219%. Ohio Works, it was estimated to be a 58% increase. And that is just for the value of land, which is then also taxed. And then with the income tax revenue, we were still able to generate, I could itemize them later. We're still able to generate millions of dollars. There are challenges when we did approve these tax abatements where there are certain things in place that they should have adhered to in terms of hiring a certain amount of residents from, the city of Youngstown, or there are certain criteria they need to follow. But I can very proudly say, upon coming to this term, I know Councilman Oliver was very passionate about that, and he spearheaded to make sure that these companies were adhering to those policies and guide. I don't know if Councilman Oliver would like to kind of speak on that in his
Sure, I would like to bring you into the conversation. So yes, Lee, from the school system to the various sort of challenges, in the labor market. Certainly Youngstown faces, some challenges but I do want to kind of hit on something that, Councilwoman, that you had brought up, that the city did benefit from, many of these deals, but at the end of the day, Councilman Oliver, it really comes down to jobs. And, the companies are getting something that is either coming from taxpayers or costing the city in terms of revenue. So how do you look at the situation when you look at, companies not delivering on jobs? And Dan has focused specifically in the first story on Chilcan. And, that's a project, as you know, that got enterprise zone tax breaks, but it also got above and beyond that, right? It got $1.5 million grant from the city to help develop a site or district. And the city also spent a substantial amount of money, I think more than $360,000, to purchase homes and relocate residents that lived in that area. And we're more than 3 years later, with, next to no security guards. So how do you look at this situation, in terms of the trade-off here, right? In terms of, when you make deals like that, how are you viewing
the Chilcan deal?
Yeah, when you vote on appropriations, like the site grant for we can talk about calculation you make when you decide to award taxpayer funds to projects.
I seen it as an opportunity for not only the residents that live there to win, but an opportunity for the city to win and be able to bring in the industry and produce jobs. So it wasn't really hard to make the decision to support the effort of this company that's coming in and promising hundreds of jobs and promising a world technology to be, headquarters. And like any business venture, you go into it thinking about the risk, but without taking those risks, you never get the reward. So I've seen it, like I said, in two ways. I've seen it as a benefit for the people that lived in that neighborhood to be able to sell their homes at a good price, not the original price that was sent out of $3,000 and $4,000-$5,000 for these people's homes. Myself and Councilwoman Adamczak went out and met with these homeowners, back to the administration and fought, to give them, over and above the amount, because not only are they being uprooted from their neighborhood, but they're also having to move away from their memories. They're having to move away from everything they've built in that community, in that neighborhood. So I felt like they should be rewarded as being part of the project to push Youngstown forward. So we got that done. Thankfully, the administration seen it our way and went and paid some of those people above and beyond to be able to not only relocate, but to move to better for everyone in the situation, because I know some of them didn't want to move, and I know particularly one resident tips. In order to push the city forward and produce those jobs, of course, myself and the rest of my colleagues seen it as a great opportunity to make that happen. The state that it currently sits in after the promises were made is an unfortunate situation. I continue to be optimistic about it. I want to see it happen. We need those jobs desperately as we speak. Number 3, which doesn't say a lot because there's supposed to be some product at this point with people being, put to work and that money coming back. It was an opportunity to advance the city in both ways. So, to me, it was a hard decision, but it was a good decision to make. Now, when I came into office, Mayor Samarone at the time appointed me to the Tax Incentive Review Committee, which basically regulates the companies that receive those tax incentives or those tax abatements, and says, whether or not you're going to continue these tax abatements. What I found when I got on that committee is that year after year, for decades, we've been giving out tax abatements, and companies basically have not been living up at all to what they said they would do in order to get those tax abatements. So one thing I put into place was basically taking it to a quarterly review instead of an annual review. So every 3 months, and our next meeting is on July 14th. So every 3 months, we get together, go over, what companies are in compliance, what companies aren't in compliance. And when I got on that committee, it was like even the companies that weren't in compliance, they were still ready to go ahead and still give them the tax abatement. And I'm like, no, you rewarding these companies that are taking advantage of the cities, taking advantage of the citizens, and basically pushing our city into more and more poverty by hiring outside the city, not hiring blacks, not hiring women, and not hiring city residents. All you're telling these companies is it's okay to screw us over. So immediately I said, we got to start setting an example. We got to start taking people's tax abatements away. We got to start putting different programs into place to be able to ensure that the citizens of Youngstown win from these tax abatements that we're giving out. So that's what we're working towards now. I think so far we've only taken away 2 tax abatements from 2 companies, but there are more on the radar right now that continue to take advantage. You have to take into factor the recession that hit in 2008, the fact that unemployment skyrocketed across the country, especially here in Youngstown. That recovery didn't start happening until around 2014. By that time, companies were kind of like, well, we don't know if we can bring on anybody else right now. So, of course, for some companies it's real, and for other companies it's just, this is what we're going to use to continue taking advantage like we've always done. So at this point this year, I instructed the Economic Development Director, Sharon Woodbury, to go ahead and start putting together different deals when it comes to tax abatement. So let's say you can't hire, like you should. You're still saving millions of dollars. So find a way to redirect those millions back into the city in some way, whether it be into the school system, whether it be in the infrastructure, whether it be into further job creation or economic development somewhere else in the city. But you can't just save money and then the taxpayers of the city continue to lose. So that's where we're at now, as well as putting pressure on Mitchell Joseph to be able to, basically, you got to poop or get off the pot. You know what I mean? Produce this factory, or we have a contingency plan, or at least I have a contingency plan to put a different company in that location if this project should fail. But like I said, I remain optimistic that it will happen. I don't have any other choice but to be optimistic that it will happen. And that's pretty much where I am.
Yeah. Can I bring in Greg LeRoy? You've looked at all sorts of financial incentives across the country and, looked at a lot of different communities that are looking at and kind of making the calculation that the council members are talking about here. How can we recruit businesses? How can we create jobs? And how can this be a win for everyone involved, right? So, when a company, when a local community decides to kind of make that trade-off there, that say, giving property tax breaks in the hopes of getting new jobs, how does it, what's your view, what's your advice to communities that are making that trade-off? And are there any practices or guardrails that can be put into place to maybe avoid an outcome like we're looking at with the chill can development in Youngstown, where you've got millions of dollars spent and no jobs yet?
Thanks, Michael. Yes. So I just want to make sure everybody knows ProPublica is a nonprofit organization that does wonderful partnering with journalistic enterprises all around the country. As a fellow nonprofit director, we want to make sure people understand that terrific role and the gap it's playing in investigative and local reporting here. Kudos to y'all for this. So to me, this is kind of deja vu all over again when I read the chill can story. I accidentally backed into this career I have of being the accountability guy on incentives when the word Rust Belt was getting coined, and when cities like Youngstown were suffering their big first, Youngstown sheet and tube and other episodes like that, when communities were beginning to fight back, when they discovered that some of the plants that were closing had gotten incentives, there was really a wave of lawsuits by states and cities starting in the mid-1980s through the early 1990s, which resulted in the first enactment of things like clawbacks or money-back guarantee language, which is one key guardrail. And another one is called performance-based incentives, which I would recommend to any city, which basically says we're going to structure the incentives to be backloaded. That is, the company doesn't get the incentive until after it delivers on its end of the deal, whatever that is, in terms of hiring, capital investment, retraining, modernization, whatever. But at the very beginning of this, I want to make sure we get sort of the cart before the horse. The most important safeguard is making sure that you don't structure the program so that it's just a gimme. That's the big problem with most incentive programs now, is that over time they've just kind of turned into political pork, even though rarely do they actually matter. That's the big dirty secret in this whole debate. Tax incentives almost never determine where companies expand or relocate. They don't because they can't, because they're too small. And here's the math. For the average company in America, if you look at their cost structure, and they obviously compare cost structures, city versus state, to decide where to go, all state and local taxes combined, property, sales, and income taxes for the average company in America at the state and local level come to just 1.8% of their cost structure, which is to say you're barely shaving off anything when you shave off 1.8. The other 98.2% of their cost structure are the business basics that really do drive their decision. Labor, occupancy, raw materials, proximity to customers, proximity to suppliers, quality of life, transportation infrastructure, schools, which obviously speaks to the talent of the labor pool. Those are the big things. And therefore, I would argue public officials like our guests here today should be focusing 98.2% of their energy on protecting the basic public goods that benefit all employers and make your place competitive from a point of view of skilled labor, efficient infrastructure, good quality of life, good schools, things that actually do matter the most to companies.
I'd offer do the council members have I'm curious to hear their response to that. I mean, I guess Councilwoman Adamczak, you had mentioned, the various, challenges, but what is being done, currently, we've been talking a lot about, kind of looking at the financial incentives programs and the shortcomings there. Should the city be, focusing its resources on the schools, quality of life, other issues, redirecting some of those resources there?
As I mentioned, because quality of life is extremely important, we have, upon coming to our first term on council, we did start a quality of life program. We have the community police officers that focused on these things, because although all aspects are important, whether it's, crime or quality of life, but depending on the neighborhood, certain things are held to more priority than in others, depending on the dynamics of the neighborhood. So we do actually invest a lot of time and effort to the quality of life, whether it's working with, different private organizations, like even YNDC is helping us with a lot of things like that, and community action plans. We are able to use CBDG HUD funding for the community policing program. I mean, so those things are extremely important as well. But I think, and in terms of school systems, so it's important to understand that the city does not hold any governance over the school system. So although we cannot control what the schools do, we can absolutely serve as allies for the school system. Both myself and Councilman Oliver, we have a fantastic relationship with the current CO, Justin Jennings, as we did with the previous CO, Krish Mohip, and we're always trying to kind of collaborate and see that how we can help, because it's a group effort. I mean, I think we all mentioned, because the school system is so important for investment, whether it's companies, coming in and wanting to bring, their companies here, or even families coming here and wanting to either start families or keep their families here. It's also important to note that when we do look at these economic incentives, specifically the tax abatements, there's kind of like a process that is followed. So we first obtain Economic Development Department from the administrative side, kind of receives preliminary information from that particular company. They ask them to submit an application. Thereafter, if economic development feels that it is going to be a viable project, they then go to the mayor to kind of ask him for his approval to continue forward. I know at that time it then gets moved to the school board. They have, I believe, about 14 days or so where they kind of, discuss it, what the pros and cons would be of extending a tax abatement, and then comes to council and we are able to vote on it. The nice thing about these is, I mean, like I said, it's unfortunate when sometimes they don't work as we hope that they work, but we are protected legally in a lot of these cases that if they do not uphold to their end of the bargain, we can either discontinue the tax abatement, or so say even potentially with the situation with the Chilcan plant, if that project does not follow through, the city of Youngstown will then, take ownership of the land, and hopefully we can entice a different project, to be there. And also, I know oftentimes when we would talk to these companies and ask them, why are you not employing the people that you said you would, and things of that nature, very frequently the response that we received is that they cannot find the employees or the skilled laborers. Do I believe that fully? No. I believe that we in Youngstown, in the city of Youngstown, and in Mahoning, Valley, we have very skilled individuals, whether it's, college educated or trades people or general laborers. So councilmen are not only just to help helping the residents, but I'm not sure if we mentioned that both Julius and I serve as the chair and vice chair of the Community Planning and Economic Development Committee for the city of Youngstown. And what we have decided to do, and very shortly, so it will be announced, we are going to hold a sort of open house and invite residents of Youngstown and the surrounding areas to come in and register with all of the skilled trades that they have, or any kind of specialties or education. So that way, when these companies come and say, hey, we cannot, say, hey, no, here is a list of everybody, you have to be able to pick from, to adhere to the guidelines. I mean, you made a promise. We're trying, to help you. You need to help us. And we can help you, but we need your help to be able to help you.
Yeah, that's really great. And that's really interesting. And I think there are folks that want to ask some questions, but Councilman Oliver, I wanted you to follow up off of this, and Councilwoman Adamczak, that's a great point about, hiring and what the city can do to make sure more residents are hired. And just for our national audience, that, to understand some of the context for what you're talking about here, Youngstown is a minority city. And what we found, in our reporting, and what, Dan found, is that just a fifth of the employees that are hired for companies getting tax incentives are actual Youngstown residents. And the number of minorities that are hired is much less. It's in the single digits in terms of percentages. So, Councilman Oliver, I guess building off of your colleagues' comments, what do you think is happening there in terms of having such a disparity between, the population and who the jobs are going to?
Well, I think it speaks a little bit to the resolution we just passed declaring racism, a public health crisis. When you look at the numbers from the Tax Incentive Review Committee, you see that when people are hired, they're outside city residents, which means they're in Boardman or Austintown or New Middlefield or somewhere far away from Youngstown. And you see that if there is a minority hired, there's particularly one or two, and then after so many months, those minorities are let go. So they don't actually get hired in. They may get hired to say, hey, we said we would do, and then they let them go. You know what I mean? So part of it, I think, has to do with Youngstown is a very close knit type of community, and when you get into it, when you get into politics, owners, you'll find that, and this was surprising to me, just being some kid from the South Side. I got into these meetings and I started meeting with people. It's like, oh, okay, so you went to, Poland High School, and your classmate's son is the manager, and he hired his cousin, and he hired his friend, and so everybody really just sticks with who they know around here. So it kind of, lends to the whole, attitude of cronyism in a way when it comes to politics and, hiring practices. But in essence, that's what keeps Youngstown in an impoverished state. So, Greg had mentioned, like the quality of life and other things that we should be putting our money into. Well, the Chill Can was a part of a larger scheme, if you would. So that played into the whole Build grant, which is a $30 million investment into downtown and YSU and the healthcare system. The entire picking up city residents downtown and being able to take them over to the Chill Can factory for work. You know what I mean? So if you was off the beaten path, or you didn't have a car, or didn't have access to WRTA, you could be able to take this ride in this autonomous shuttle, which is part of that Build grant, and go to work at the Chill Can plant. What's happening is, I think you see a shift in priorities when it comes to administrations, okay? McNally focused, in my opinion, so much on Youngstown itself. You know what I mean? Like, okay, we got our first hotel in 30 years under McNally. We got the amphitheater under McNally. We got, we got money invested into the neighborhoods under McNally, programs on demolition and quality of life. And, you seen when I went to him about the tax incentive review, he basically said, Councilman Oliver, do whatever you feel is best to be able to push the city forward, make sure that our citizens win. And his attitude was, the same people that vote for you are the same people that vote for me. So we in this together. We got to do this together to make sure Youngstown residents win. So it was a lot of focus on helping the school systems. It was a lot of focus on, building infrastructure. It was just a lot of focus on Youngstown, which is something that I haven't seen in a long time. So for whatever reason, it got rid of that administration. The new administration came in and, loved the guy. But I don't know what the focus is for the city anymore. You know what I mean? So I think some people are taking advantage of that. You know what I mean? And they're saying, okay, now is the time we can get in, we can get our hands on some things in Youngstown, because everything is so scattered right now. You know what I mean? I don't know where the focus is anymore to be able to say City Council is going to be able to help in this area of economic development, or be able to help in this area of creating better quality of life for the citizens. Because basically, no matter what Basia and I come up with on City Council as far as policy, if the administration doesn't push the button on pushing that forward, then the city still stays stagnant. Right. So I think, to better answer your question, the city is going to need to put forth a strategic plan that says, this is where we're trying to go in the city. This is what our citizens need. We need housing. We need jobs. We need, economic growth in the private sector. We need all these things to be able to surround projects like the Chill Can, be able to attract other businesses in, to fix our school system so property values can go up, so we can have a whole cohesive plan to be able to push the city forward. But I think right now, when it's kind of topsy-turvy, nothing really is getting done in a productive manner to be able to benefit our citizens. And I think that's part of what we're dealing with right now.
Definitely have some folks that want to ask some questions. But Greg, do you have a really quick point on the hiring issue?
I hear 3 private sector labor market data points here. I hear just saying employers can't find sufficient. The rate of local and are too low, and I hear Julius talking about the problems, and improve local and minority hiring is by 2 things. One is you can create a local hiring preference in your incentive programs. Chance to qualify for job systems through a local hiring program tied to your incentive. That's legal, and I'll send you links on successful programs in other cities. The second point really goes to redirecting money away from property tax abatements to a customized training program. There may be some marginal skills improvements that local residents need to better compete for the jobs that are being created, and that would be a much better bang for your buck than giving automatic property tax abatements, and much more cost effective. And even if those people don't end up keeping those jobs for a long period of time, they're going to keep those skills so you don't lose your investment.
Great, thank
May
you.
I just briefly direct response to Greg? I absolutely, I agree with you. I think we do need to look into other things and other incentives, as I say, with a lot of things that's going on in the city. Maybe we don't have the perfect solution right now and we will still have to modify it, but if status quo isn't working, we need to move away from that and perhaps try something different. Maybe that won't be the magical solution, but we need to be open. We know a change needs to be made and needs to start somewhere. So I mean, if you what you're referencing, sounds great, and I'm sure Julius as well. We would love to hear your ideas. What else we could what we could implement and be doing.
Just briefly to add to what my colleague is saying, that's kind of what we put in place with our most recent tax abatement deal with Tool and Die, is basically mandating that they put in a work study or apprenticeship program with Youngstown City Schools to be able to bring those students in, train them along, so that by the time it's time for them to have full-time employment, they're already skilled up for those jobs. So that's the way we're moving now and taking those steps for the abatement. So hopefully with the link you send us, we can continue to add.
Great. Thank you. Cynthia, so do we have folks that want to ask some questions?
We do. And as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to type it to us. Our first question comes from Eric, who asks, why aren't more provisions written into these deals to allow for the city to have recourse when specific metrics aren't met? For example, a loan that is forgiven if X jobs are created. Aren't these types of grants irresponsible?
So Councilman Oliver, I saw you raise your hand there.
So in speaking to our Director of Economic Development, I asked that question. I said, what are our legal ramifications for people that basically screw us over when it comes to these taxes? I'm sorry, excuse my language. I'm a real person. So what do we do when a company doesn't live up to their promises? And her answer to me was basically, we have to work within the state guidelines. So according to the state guidelines, she says the only thing we can do is revoke their tax incentive. So I'm like, okay, I understand that from the state, but as a city with our own charter, you know what I mean, and us being our own municipality, we should be able to write in some things that will strengthen our own policy, and that's going to have to come from us having a strong law department. And that I'll just kind of leave that right there.
Yeah, Councilwoman?
And I'm sorry if I may, piggybacking off of what Councilman Oliver said, I agree, and I believe there are certain provisions in place anytime we do these kinds of tax incentives. And I apologize, one of you gentlemen earlier mentioned, I think you recommended, which I think is something that Julius and I should look into and ask for law department. I believe one of you mentioned to wait to give, I think, the abatements or these incentives on the back end after they go through what their promise is. That, I believe that's what one of you mentioned, and I think that's definitely something
performance-based.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's something definitely worth visiting. But as Councilman Oliver said, we have to make sure that we have a strong and prepared law department to know all the ins and outs about that.
And I think another point there is that you can have all of the language in these agreements stated out, but you've also got to have the political will to enforce those particular agreements as well. And that's, I think, one of the major things that we found out was that despite them, these companies falling short on a lot of their promises and a lot of their creations, the city in the past certainly hadn't taken that initiative to really hold them accountable for for them falling short, in some cases quite severely on a number of these agreements, and yet they've collected all the benefits from the city. So really interesting, I think, thinking in the right direction here and trying to at least formulate a better policy that protects the interests of Youngstown, protects the interests of the city itself, while also trying to stimulate economic development in other ways also. But you can have all the language you want to in there, but you need to enforce it. And I think the tax incentive review councils have to step up, I think, and really take a hard look at these.
And if I may, just one more comment. I just really have to give a lot of credit to Councilman Oliver, because he's the one that was so adamant when he sat on this committee, and he looked and said, oh my goodness, how are these companies for years now not, I guess, pulling their end of the bargain? And it was because of his efforts and bringing it to the rest of the board and, saying, no, we have to review these, systematically, regularly. And those individuals that are not adhering to these guidelines, we have to discontinue their tax incentive. And it is because of Julius's efforts that was finally being done.
It comes to your point, Dan. It comes down to people actually doing their job. So if your job is to keep track of the compliance of these companies, and you're basically just not doing that, you know what I mean? The companies are going to automatically think, well, it's okay because nobody's checking us. You know what I mean? So the pressure comes in, do your job, or you don't have a job. So I don't understand how some people within our city government are okay with poverty in our city due to the fact that they're not doing their job. So, and then you get, companies use scare tactics, and they're like, oh, well, if you don't do this, then we'll uproot the company, we'll go somewhere else. And my attitude is like, man, bye. I mean, what's the benefit for us anyway? You know what I mean? So if that's how you feel, you can go ahead and go, and we can find somebody else to come in here. And I think for years, politically, people just wash their hands up because they like, if I stir up trouble, or if I rock the boat, this could affect my next campaign. I might not get reelected. And elected officials do not represent people anymore. They represent these companies and these organizations and people that got other interests instead of representing the people that voted them in the office. So I think you're right. You got to have the political muscle or wherewithal to be able to say, look, my fight is for the citizens of Youngstown. Sometimes it comes down to you losing your job to do the right thing. And I think that's what got to happen moving forward.
Our next question was actually emailed in advance, and it's from Dan, not Dan O'Brien, a different one. And this is for the council members. I would like to understand the process from when a company makes their initial inquiry to the awarding of the incentives, specific steps like data collection, for example. What does that process look like?
I can't really, maybe my colleague can speak to that, but as council, we ourselves don't go through the whole steps of vetting the company. That's something that the administration does. When they're done vetting the company and going through those steps, they bring that deal to city council to approve it or disapprove it. So our information comes from the administration, from economic development, from the law department, and then it comes to us to either vote it up or vote it down. So I don't know if you want to elaborate, Basia.
Yes, thank you. And I apologize, just so I don't misinform anyone, like I said, I'm going to read from some of my notes. So when a company is interested in applying for one of these tax incentive programs, They were designed through the enterprise zone that we were discussing before, and then they are eligible through the state of Ohio incentive program. And these programs allow 100% abatement of real estate taxes at a rate that is then determined by the city of Youngstown. But these abatements only apply to the new construction or improved value, and cannot be used for existing property taxes assessed by the county. So then once the economic development department assesses the proposed projects, it determines if the tax abatements will be offered and will be like kind of fruitful to the city. At that time, they do make their recommendation to the mayor. And if the incentive is offered to the business, the company has to they're required to do a whole application stating, how many jobs they're going to produce, things of that nature. And there is a whole cumbersome eligibility requirement that kind of follows the Ohio Revised Code. And as I mentioned earlier, at that point, the full application is then sent to the school board of the Youngstown City Schools for 14 days to review. During that period, it is then sent to council. It first comes before the Community Planning Economic Development Committee, which, as I mentioned, myself, Julius, is on there, as well as our colleague Lauren McNally. And then if council approves it, the zone agreement legislation is drafted. It's submitted then to the Board of Controls for final approval, and then also the report is sent to the Tax Incentive Review Council, and they will then determine what the period of the tax abatement should be. And then it comes back to council for review and final approval. But then after that, throughout the process, the Tax Incentive Review Committee should be looking at this along with, on the administrative side, our Economic Development Department, to make sure that these businesses are adhering to the guidelines that were presented to them.
And a company is often required to fill out what looks like a standard application from the Ohio Development Services Agency, in which they explain the nature of the project, how many jobs they anticipate as a result of it, the nature of the investment, the amount of the investment. And those are that's the type of information that is usually associated with one of those applications, which could be, some of them could be 40 pages long in some cases, or 20 pages long at least. So that's generally how the process begins, as far as I understand the information gleaned that's available to the city. So you're often reliant on the company for that information alone, and it's really difficult and impossible sometimes for elected officials, of course, to open the books of a private company and say, hey, listen, we want to see what you have here.
Yeah.
Greg, did you have something?
To Dan's point, no state or local law allows governments to crawl inside the company's black box decision-making process for choosing site location. And frankly, there's a long, I jokingly call it the tax break industrial complex. There's actually a system which has roots in the late 1930s in a company called Fantas, the granddaddy of the site location consulting firms, which has set up this very corporate-dominated site location system in which public officials are in what game theorists would call a prisoner's dilemma. They're not allowed to talk to each other. You're not allowed to talk to Akron. Ohio's not allowed to talk to Michigan, et cetera, et cetera. You're supposed to take for granted whatever the company says to you and believe whatever they say to you about how much or how little the tax breaks matter, because you're not allowed to talk to your competing locations. There is one part of Ohio that has figured this out and fought back. For more than 25 years, the Dayton metropolitan area and Montgomery County has a sort of ceasefire cooperative agreement in place, spearheaded originally by the city and now the county, to basically say, if a company is sitting in suburb A of Dayton and talks to city B about running away and getting a tax break, the two cities are required to talk to each other and required to tell the company that they're cooperating, and then they've broken out of the prison and they're not in the prisoner's dilemma anymore. Nobody's telling the company where to go, and the company may move, but they favor retention and they favor stability.
Our next question is from, you can go ahead.
And I'm sorry, the one last thing I wanted to mention, with COVID going on, we're facing a new dynamic where previously everything was done in person, which a lot of times that was challenging for residents to be able to, attend to these meetings. But all of these meetings are public. So I think now, as we're doing them, via teleconference and they're able to be streamed live, I think it's great for residents to log on and I guess kind of watch so they're more, educated on the process and they could be, a little bit more involved. So I think that's great.
Our next question is for Greg from Tim. What is the role of perception in site selection? That is, do more selective cities actually do better in the competition for corporate investment?
Well, the truth is those cities that are, because of the sort of market-based system that's dominated, the corporate dominated system here, cities that are perceived to have higher quality of life can be more selective, at least for hiring certain kinds of employers. I mean, it's certainly most evident right now in the high technology sector, where it's a winner-take-all economy, where the hyper winning places, the San Franciscos and the Washingtons and the Boston of the world, are hogging the markets for information technology, labor markets right now. But that's only a slice of the economy, and it's certainly not the place where Youngstown's going to be competing, right? Perception is important. If a company says we're going to stay here and we want to hire people from the local school system and we want to be able to transfer some managers in here, and can we get people to agree to move here based on the quality of life and the quality of the schools and the quality of the infrastructure? That's the meaningful perception for a city like Youngstown.
And a lot of companies have done that without the assistance of tax abatements. We have to keep that in perspective as well. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of companies that have done very, very well in Mahoning Valley and never accepted a single dime in public subsidy.
Because you've got the business basics. You got the 98.2% of inputs that really matter.
I think everybody also has to take into consideration that there seems to be this unseen effort to keep Youngstown in the state that it's in. I don't know who's leading this effort, but you'll see multiple companies that were coming to Youngstown and then somehow they get diverted to Trumbull County, or they get diverted to Austintown, but they were always coming to Youngstown. They're coming to check out Youngstown, and then for whatever reason, they're gone. You know what I mean? So when this chill can thing came about, and it's like, oh in Youngstown, it was kind of like, we finally gonna win one. You know what I mean? So in these tax abatement situations, the city never 100% loses, because it's always a new tax. So where there was no tax coming in at all, now there's at least a new tax. It's not 100%, but there's something where there's nothing. But I think what our residents and anybody that can help have to get down to is, why is it seem to be this effort to keep everything out of Youngstown, to keep Youngstown residents in poverty? Because it really seems like that's what's happening.
Okay, actually, I'm going to take one more question from the audience before we close out with maybe one last question from Michael. From Jenna, is anyone around the country doing pilots that reinvest money into revolving loan funds that are able to provide capital to small local businesses? We have these big companies like Chilcan, Lordstown Energy, and TJX that are getting pats on the back for giving a few $100,000 to get a new track while being let off the hook for a multi-million-dollar tax bill. So the first part, are there pilots that are reinvesting money to provide capital to small local businesses?
So to explain the term here, pilot, the acronym stands for payments in lieu of taxes. And these are deep discounts typically on property taxes, where companies pay maybe 10% or 15% of what they would have paid normally in lieu of 100% of their normal property tax bill. I'm not aware of cities using them specifically for revolving loan funds, that is friendly loan funds for small businesses. It could be happening. There's lots of other traditional sources of revenue that are used for small business lending, including federal monies from the Small Business Administration and other Commerce Department programs like that. But look, the more property tax revenue you have, no matter how you get it, by not abating it, the more money you have to help small businesses. And we know small businesses need the help the most now to come out of the pandemic.
So we're out of time, except for one last question, perhaps, from Michael. Can you close us out with one last question for the panel?
Yeah, sure. So thank you everyone for taking the time. I think this has been a great conversation, and we've heard a lot of paths forward, right? So we're not just rehashing old news here. You know, you're doing quarterly monitoring, you know, of tax incentive agreements. You're exploring things like perhaps holding companies more accountable by if they're not meeting hiring requirements, not hiring city residents, forcing them to redirect money into things like schools or other city programs. There's an upcoming open house, you know, for residents of Youngstown to register their skills. You know, that could be a potential clearinghouse for companies that want to hire city residents. So a lot of good things going on in this area. But I did want to, just starting with Dan, just to get some quick closing thoughts, bringing it back to the current moment, right, in the pandemic. And Councilman Oliver, you know, you said, you know, historically, you know, folks have been elected officials, whether it's in the administration or on city council, having this kind of, you know, air of desperation, this, you know, let's not rock the boat. You know, this is potentially big, so we're not going to hold, you know, companies accountable for this if they miss targets or they miss that. So given that I'm hearing, you know, that there is a renewed commitment, right, to holding these companies accountable, looking at what companies are doing in terms of hiring, how do you think the current moment, the economic crisis that we're in right now with the pandemic, do you think that the political will be there, and how tough can you be in an environment where jobs and the economy are tops? And Dan, I'll just to start it off.
Well, it's going to be more difficult, certainly, and you take into broad economic conditions like this in terms of hiring per se, because everybody's laid off as a result of a coronavirus. So it's certainly going to make it a little bit more difficult, I think. But I think the broader question is to craft a policy in which you're not in this place, and that you're not in a position to go clawing back after companies that have fallen short of these promises in that sense. Just a real quick example for in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, for example, they have a tax abatement system in which it walks down percentage-wise every year. So it may start at 90% and then eventually gradually reduce it to 10% over 10 years. So there is a sense in which there's some return, I mean, after 5 years or so, that the city realizes in terms of that nature. You know, it's sort of a way to protect the city's interests, at the same time providing some incentive for business as well. That seems a little bit more practical, a little bit more fair than giving someone a blanket 75% or 100% abatement over a 10-year period.
Councilman Oliver?
I think this is basically a perfect time for the city of Youngstown to reinvent itself. We're dealing with things on multiple levels: COVID, racism, and the city, the citizens, city council. We're demanding things done in a whole new way. So I think it's a perfect time for the city's departments, the city's administration of this is the way we've always done it, so this is the way we're going to continue to do it. No, there's examples like Dan just mentioned all over the country where economic development departments and city administrations are doing things totally unprecedented. And I think it's time for us to take note of that and start doing things according to what our citizens need, not what outside sources want to see happen.
Councilwoman Adamczak?
Thank you. I definitely think, conversations like this is what kind of sparks new ideas and opens up new roads and doors of doing things a little bit differently. I mean, as I mentioned, if status quo isn't working, we need to try other things. And just listening to all of you and all, your perspective, expertise. I would, even outside of this, like to continue conversation to get some ideas, to see what's working in, neighboring cities and other things, to try to bring some of those, policies in place here in Youngstown. And I think above all, it's important to not only residents to stay, involved and educated in what's going on, but also for residents to realize how important it is to vote the correct officials in, to make sure officials are in that are not just following a certain, political agenda or scared to ruffle feathers for the fear of they may, lose votes. Last time, we are put in this position and entrusted, to be fiscally responsible and responsible with our taxpayers, with their taxes and all the investment that is being done. So I think we just need to have strong leaders in office, and even both on the administrative side, just to make sure that they are truly doing what they should, that they have the best interest of heart of their city and not, private agendas. So I think we need to continue working together, and it's always the most success comes out of collaborative efforts. None of us know everything. There's not one single solution. I think things like this, and being able to brainstorm is really what's going to help, succeed and move the city forward and Mahoning Valley in a whole.
Great. Greg LeRoy, do you have a final thought?
Sympathetically to the council members, I say, look, this tax break industrial complex born 83 years ago has many moving parts. For you, its role is to degrade and demean you and depress you and make you an easy mark for outrageous demands. But now that you know that tax breaks almost never matter, that property taxes are a microscopic cost factor for your typical employer, that the business basics comprise 98.2% of a company's calculations about where to go, I hope will embolden you to realize that when you defend your public goods, when you defend your education system and your infrastructure efficiency and your quality of life, you're making good economic development. And it's also much fairer for the small and existing long-standing corporate citizens in your employer base, right? You don't want to play favorites. You do want to help the existing companies grow and get better at what they do. Finally, cooperate with your neighboring officials. Break out of the prisoner's dilemma. Don't let them tell you who you can and cannot talk to. You must rebel, because the whole system also is very much dependent on public officials not cooperating. You subvert that dogma when you talk to your neighbors.
Okay, so that's all our time for today. Thank you so much to our speakers for what was a really great conversation. I also want to thank the co-sponsors for this event, along with the Business Journal and ProPublica. That's WKSU Radio and the City Club of Mahoning Valley. And from all of us, thank you for joining today, and have a great day. Next time.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
717 Credit Union. Business services designed to meet your daily needs. Commercial loans, business deposits, merchant and payroll services. 717 Credit Union. It's knowing you were treated right every time. 717 Credit Union. Business services designed to meet your daily needs. Commercial loans, business deposits, merchant and payroll services. 717 Credit Union. It's knowing you were treated right every time.